unsure. Here's an expanded version of Key Point 1, written seamlessly in a conversational tone, as if it's part of the speech. You know, it's funny how simple God's commands often seem. They're usually straightforward, clear instructions, clear direction. And yet, it's that simplicity that seems to challenge us the most. Think about it. God tells us, don't look. And suddenly, it's the only thing we want to do. Why is that? Why do we wrestle so much with something that requires no skill, no effort, just obedience? It's because trust is harder than we think. Obedience to God's word is not about understanding the logic behind his instructions. It's about trusting the one who gives them. Let me ask you this. When God tells you to step forward, do you hesitate because you're trying to figure out why he told you? Or do you move because you know he knows what's best for you? That's the real question. We're so conditioned to want answers, to demand explanations, to analyze every step before we take it. But faith doesn't work like that. Faith is built on trust, and trust requires surrender. When God told Lot and his family to flee Sodom and not look back, it wasn't up for debate. He didn't give them a long explanation or a motivational speech. He didn't tell them why looking back would cost them everything. He just said, go, don't look back. And that was enough. At least it should have been enough. But we all know what happened. Lot's wife looked back. She turned around, and in that one moment of hesitation, she lost everything. What killed her wasn't just disobedience, it was a lack of trust. A momentary doubt that what lay ahead was better than what she was leaving behind. And don't we do the same thing? We say we trust God, but then we hold on to the things he's trying to pull us away from. We look back on our mistakes, our past lives, our comfort zones, thinking somehow there's something back there worth saving. But God sees what we can't. He knows the destruction that lies behind us and the promises waiting ahead. His command to not look isn't about restriction, it's about protection. The truth is, trusting God isn't about knowing all the details. It's about knowing his heart. It's about understanding that his love for us runs so deep, he will never lead us into harm. And yet we struggle, we question, we hesitate. Why? Because we think our vision is clearer than his. We convince ourselves that we need to know everything before we act. But trust isn't built on explanations. It's built on relationship. It's built on knowing that the one who created the universe is the same one who holds our lives in his hands. Think about a child learning to walk. They don't stop to ask their parent, why should I take this step? What happens if I fall? They just move forward because they trust the hands that are guiding them. They know their parents' love will catch them if they stumble. That's the kind of trust God wants from us. He's not asking us to understand every detail. He's asking us to take his hand and walk. But here's the challenge. Trust requires us to let go of control. It requires us to silence that voice in our head that says, I need to see the whole picture first. It requires us to believe that God's command is enough, even when it doesn't make sense. And when we do that, when we step out in faith, even when we're scared, even when we're unsure, that's when God moves in ways we can't even imagine. The problem is we live in a world that teaches us the opposite. Society tells us don't trust anyone but yourself. If you don't have a plan, you'll fail. If you don't know the outcome, don't take the risk. But God's way is different. He says, trust me and I'll direct your steps. Obey me and I'll lead you into blessings you can't comprehend. Surrender to me and I'll give you peace that surpasses understanding. His commands are not burdensome. They're invitations. Invitations to live freely, without fear, without doubt, without hesitation. And let's be honest, some of us are holding on to things God has already told us to leave behind. We're still looking back at past failures, toxic relationships, bad habits, because we're afraid of what lies ahead. But let me tell you something. God's plans for you are better than anything you're holding on to. When he says, don't look, he's telling you, what I have for you is greater than anything you're leaving behind. So today I want to challenge you. Whatever God is asking of you, whatever he's calling you to step into, to walk away from, or to trust him with, don't hesitate. Don't let fear or doubt rob you of what he has in store. Obey his voice, trust his plan, and most importantly, move forward knowing that his commands are always rooted in love. Because when God says, don't look, He's not trying to take something from you, he's trying to lead you into something far greater. Would you like adjustments to this segment or the tone? Here's an expanded version of Key Point 2, written to flow seamlessly and maintain alignment with the tone of the speech. Distractions. They creep in so subtly, don't they? We start with good intentions, a clear goal, a sense of purpose, but somewhere along the way, our attention shifts. Something catches our eye, and before we know it, we've veered off course. That's how distractions work. They don't always come loudly, announcing themselves as obstacles. No, they're sneaky, quiet, and often disguised as things that seem harmless. But let me tell you this. Distractions are one of the enemy's greatest tools. If he can't stop you outright, he'll distract you until you stop yourself. When God says, "Don't look," he's not just giving a command for the sake of it. He's warning us about the power of distractions to derail our journey. Look at the story of Lot's wife. She wasn't distracted by something big or shiny. She was distracted by the past, by what she was leaving behind. And isn't that so often the case with us? We get caught up looking at things that no longer serve us, things God has already told us to leave behind. And in doing so, we lose sight of where we're going. Think about this. Distractions aren't always about physical things. Sometimes they're thoughts, regrets, what-ifs. Have you ever been so consumed by thinking about what went wrong in your past that you couldn't focus on the opportunities right in front of you? That's how distractions work. They don't just steal your attention, they steal your momentum. They keep you stuck in one place, unable to move forward. And all the while, God is saying, don't look, don't turn back, keep moving. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to keep your eyes forward when everything around you is pulling at your attention. The world we live in is full of noise, social media, the news, the opinions of others. They all demand our focus, leaving little room for the quiet voice of God. And if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves so consumed by these distractions that we forget what God called us to do in the first place. Let me share something with you. Distractions don't just slow you down, they change your perspective. When you focus on the wrong things, you start to see everything through a distorted lens. You lose sight of the bigger picture. That's why God tells us to fix our eyes on Him, because when we're focused on Him, everything else falls into place. When we're focused on Him, the distractions lose their power. But let's be honest, sometimes the distractions aren't just external. Sometimes they're internal. Our own doubts, fears, and insecurities can be some of the biggest distractions we face. We start questioning whether we're good enough, whether we're capable, whether God's promises really apply to us. And in doing so, we take our eyes off the path He's laid out for us. We let the noise inside our heads drown out His voice. Here's the thing, distractions will always be there. The enemy will always try to pull your attention away from God's plan, but you have a choice. You can choose to stay focused. You can choose to trust God's direction, even when the distractions are loud. You can choose to silence the noise and fix your eyes on what truly matters. And let's not forget, distractions often come disguised as things that seem important. Opportunities, responsibilities, even relationships can become distractions if they're not aligned with God's will. That's why discernment is so important. You have to ask yourself, is this thing helping me move forward, or is it holding me back? Is it drawing me closer to God, or is it pulling me away? It's not easy. Staying focused requires discipline. It requires saying no to things that might seem good so you can say yes to what God has for you. It requires being intentional about where you direct your energy and attention. But let me tell you this, it's worth it. Because when you stay focused on God's plan, you position yourself to receive everything He has for you. When you refuse to let distractions take over, you create space for God to move in your life. So today I want to challenge you. Take a moment to reflect on the distractions in your life. What's pulling your attention away from where God is leading you? What's keeping you stuck, looking back instead of moving forward? Whatever it is, let it go. Don't let the enemy use distractions to rob you of your purpose. Keep your eyes forward. Keep your heart fixed on God's promises. And remember, when God says don't look, it's not because He's trying to take something from you. His power sets trying not to take you. It's because He's trying to give you something far greater, Let me know if you'd like further refinement or expansion. Here's an expanded version of key point 3 written to flow naturally within the speech. Faith in moving forward is one of the hardest things to hold on to because it requires us to walk into what we cannot see. God calls us to a path that isn't always lit with clarity, it's lit with trust. The only thing He asks us to bring is our willingness to move. And yet, moving forward often feels like the scariest thing to do. There's uncertainty, there's fear. There's the nagging temptation to turn around and run back to what's familiar, even if we know deep down it's no longer good for us. But faith doesn't work in reverse. Faith isn't about clinging to what we know or what feels comfortable. It's about stepping into what's unknown, simply because God said go. And sometimes that's all we have. His voice saying, move forward. No map, no instructions, no safety net. Just His word. That's hard, isn't it? But let me tell you this, the reward for faith is never found behind you. It's always ahead of you. Think about the Israelites as they stood before the Red Sea. God told Moses to lead them forward, but where? All they could see was an impossible wall of water in front of them and an army closing in behind them. If there was ever a moment to panic, that was it. And yet God didn't call them to look for another route or turn back to Egypt. He called them to trust Him and move forward. And what happened? The sea split. The impossible opened up before them. But it didn't happen while they were standing still. It happened as they stepped out in faith, moving in the direction God had called them to, even though it made no sense in the moment. That's what faith in moving forward looks like. It's walking when you don't see the path. It's trusting that God has already gone ahead of you, making a way where there seems to be no way. It's believing that His promises are bigger than your fears. But let me ask you this. How often do we hesitate at the edge of our Red Sea? How often do we stop and turn around, thinking the life we had before, even with its struggles and chains, feels safer than the unknown ahead? The truth is, moving forward requires us to leave some things behind. That's what makes it so difficult. You can't walk into the future God has for you while clinging to the past He's calling you out of. You can't step into His promises while holding on to the very things He's asking you to let go of. And that's why so many of us struggle to move forward. It's not that we don't believe God is able, it's that we're afraid of what we might lose in the process. But let me remind you of something. The God who calls you forward isn't asking you to leave things behind because He wants to deprive you. He's asking you to let go because what He has ahead is so much greater. And yes, it's hard to see that in the moment. Yes, it's hard to walk away from what feels safe, what feels familiar. But faith isn't about seeing everything clearly. Faith is about trusting that what God has prepared for you is far better than what you could ever prepare for yourself. One of the most beautiful things about faith is that it's not just about where you're going, it's about who you're walking with. When God calls you to move forward, He doesn't leave you to figure it out on your own. He's right there with you, guiding your steps, strengthening you when you're weak, and reminding you that you're never alone. The same God who split the sea for the Israelites is the same God walking beside you, saying, "Trust me, I've got you, keep moving." And let's not forget, faith isn't just about the big dramatic steps. Sometimes moving forward looks like the small, quiet acts of obedience that nobody else sees. It's choosing to pray when you feel like giving up. It's choosing to forgive when you'd rather hold a grudge. It's choosing to keep believing when everything around you says to stop. Those small steps of faith add up. They build momentum. They carry you forward even when the way feels uncertain. So here's my challenge to you. Whatever God is calling you to step into, no matter how impossible it seems, no matter how uncertain it feels, take that step. Even if you're scared, even if you're unsure, take it anyway, because every step of faith moves you closer to His promises. Every step of faith opens the door for God to do the miraculous in your life. And remember this, faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. When God says move forward, He's not asking you to figure it all out. He's asking you to trust that He already has. So don't let fear hold you back. Don't let doubt paralyze you. Keep your eyes on Him. Keep your heart anchored in His Word and take the step, because the future He's calling you into is far greater than anything you're leaving behind. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to adjust or elaborate on. Is an expanded version of Key Point 4, maintaining a seamless and conversational tone. Let's talk about work for a moment, but not the kind of work the world often glorifies. Long hours, busyness for the sake of busyness, chasing after titles and accolades. No, I'm talking about the work God has placed in front of you. The work that's tied to your purpose. Because let's be honest, we're all working on something. The question is, are we working on the right thing? Are we focused on what God has called us to do, or are we caught up in what we think we should be doing? You see, when God gives us an assignment, it's never random, it's never meaningless. There's always a purpose behind it. But here's where we get tripped up. We confuse our own plans with God's plans. We think, if I just work hard enough, if I just push through, I'll get to where I want to be. And while there's value in effort without direction is just wasted energy. God doesn't want us to simply work hard. He wants us to work with purpose. Think about Adam in the Garden of Eden. The very first thing God did after creating Adam was give him work. He told him to tend the garden, to care for it, to steward it well. Adam wasn't just sitting around enjoying the view, he had a job to do. But here's the key, Adam's work wasn't separate from his relationship with God, it was part of it. His work was an act of obedience, an act of worship. That's what work is meant to be. It's not just about tasks or to-do lists. It's about partnering with God in His plan. But let's be real, sometimes the work God calls us to doesn't look glamorous. It doesn't come with applause or recognition. It might even feel small or insignificant. And that's where we struggle. We want the big assignments, the visible impact, the things that make us feel important. But God doesn't measure work the way we do. He's not looking for flashy results. He's looking for faithfulness. He's looking for people who will say, "Yes, Lord," even when the work feels hard, even when it feels mundane, even when nobody else notices. The truth is, the work God calls us to isn't always about us. Sometimes it's about what He's doing through us. It's about planting seeds that we may never see grow. It's about being faithful in the little things so that He can trust us with more. It's about understanding that the impact of our work isn't always immediate. It's eternal. And let's not forget, God's work isn't limited to a specific area of life. It's not just about ministry or church. God calls us to work in every part of our lives, in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces. Wherever He's placed you, that's where your work is. That's your mission field. It might not look like someone else's work, and that's okay. Comparison has no place in God's plan. Your assignment is uniquely yours, and it's exactly what He's equipped you for. But here's the thing, we can't do God's work while holding on to our own agenda. We can't fulfill His purpose while chasing after our own version of success. That's why it's so important to stay connected to Him, to seek His guidance every step of the way. Because without Him, even our best efforts will fall short. Without Him, the work we do becomes just noise, just motion, just empty striving. So how do we stay aligned with God's purpose? It starts with surrender. It starts with saying, God, I trust your plan more than my own. I trust that the work you've called me to is exactly where I need to be. And it's not just about saying it, it's about living it. It's about showing up every day with a heart that's willing, with hands that are ready, with faith that says, I may not see the whole picture, but I trust that you do. And don't think for a second that the work God has for you is too small to matter. Sometimes the smallest acts of obedience have the greatest impact. Sometimes the behind-the-scenes faithfulness leads to the biggest breakthroughs. God doesn't waste anything. Every moment, every effort, every step of obedience. It all matters in His plan. So today I want to challenge you. What work has God placed in front of you? What assignment has He called you to? Whatever it is, don't take it lightly. Don't let distractions or doubts pull you away from it. Lean into it. Commit to it. Trust that He's using it for something greater than you can see right now. Because when you align your work with His will, when you do what He's called you to do, you're not just working, you're worshiping. And that's the kind of work that changes everything. Let me know if you'd like this refined further. Here's an expanded version of key point 5. There's something powerful about staying focused on the promises of God, isn't there? It's not always easy, though. Life has this way of throwing distractions and doubts in our path, trying to convince us that what God said won't come to pass. But here's the truth. God's promises don't change, even when our circumstances do. They remain firm, unshaken, and as true today as they were when He first spoke them over your life. But let's talk about why it's so difficult to stay focused on those promises. The first reason is that we're so easily influenced by what we see. Our eyes tell us one thing, and God tells us another, and we find ourselves stuck in this tension between faith and sight. You might see a closed door where God has spoken of an open one. You might see delay where God has promised provision, and in those moments it's so tempting to start doubting, to start wondering if you heard Him correctly, or if the promise was ever meant for you. That's why staying focused is a matter of trust. It's saying, God, even if I don't see it yet, even if it doesn't make sense right now, I'm going to hold on to what you said. And let me tell you, there's power in that kind of faith. There's power in refusing to let go of God's word, even when everything around you is screaming for your attention. But let's be honest, focus requires discipline. It's not something that just happens. It's something you have to choose. Every single day you have to make the decision to fix your eyes on God's promises instead of the distractions around you. And those distractions come in many forms. Sometimes they're external, like other people's opinions, unexpected setbacks, or even opportunities that look good but aren't aligned with God's will. Other times the distractions are internal. They're the doubts in your mind, the fear in your heart, the insecurities that whisper, what if you're not good enough? What if it doesn't work out? But here's what you need to know. Distractions don't have the power to derail God's promises, but they do have the power to derail your focus. And when you lose focus, you start to drift. You start to settle for less than what God has for you. You start to believe the lie that the promise isn't worth the wait. Think about Peter walking on water. As long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he did the impossible. He stepped out of the boat, walked across the waves, and defied every natural law. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. The promise was still there. Jesus hadn't moved. But Peter's focus had shifted. And that's what happens to us. When we take our eyes off God's promises and start looking at the challenges around us, we lose the faith we need to keep moving forward. But here's the good news. Just like Jesus reached out to Peter and pulled him up, God is always ready to refocus us when we lose our way. His grace is big enough to cover our moments of doubt, and His love is strong enough to pull us back onto the path He's called us to. So even if you've been distracted, even if you've taken your eyes off the promise, it's not too late to refocus. It's not too late to say, God, I'm coming back. I'm fixing my eyes on you again. And let me tell you, there's a reason God wants us to stay focused on His promises. It's not just about reaching the destination. It's about who we become along the way. The process of holding on to His promises refines us. It strengthens our faith, builds our character, and teaches us to rely on Him in ways we never would have otherwise. Sometimes the waiting is part of the promise. Sometimes the struggle is part of the story. But make no mistake, the promise is always worth it. What God has for you is so much greater than anything you could imagine for yourself. His timing is perfect. His plans are flawless, and His promises never fail. So don't let temporary circumstances rob you of the eternal truth of His word. Don't let fear, doubt, or distractions pull you away from what He's spoken over your life. Instead, fix your eyes on Him. Surround yourself with His word. Remind yourself daily of what He's promised, and when the distractions come, and they will, choose to refocus. Choose to stand firm. Choose to trust that what God said will come to pass, no matter what it looks like right now. Because His word is true, His promises are faithful, and His plans for you are good. Keep holding on, keep believing, keep moving forward. The promise is closer than you think. Let me know if you'd like any additional adjustments. Here's an expanded version of key point 6. There's a profound truth about trusting God's direction that we often wrestle with. It's this. His way will rarely look like ours. The path He calls us to might feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or even impossible. And yet it's always the right path. because He's the one guiding it. But let's be honest, trusting that direction can feel like walking blindfolded. It's not easy. Our natural tendency is to want control, to want all the answers before we take the first step. But God doesn't work that way. He doesn't give us the whole blueprint up front because He knows that if He did, we'd start relying on the plan instead of Him. Trust is built in the unknown. It's in those moments when we don't have all the answers, when we can't see the full picture, that we learn to lean not on our own understanding, but on His. And that's the beauty of it. God's direction isn't about clarity, it's about relationship. It's about walking with Him step by step, even when the way ahead feels uncertain. But let's talk about why that's so difficult. It's because God's timing and methods don't align with ours. We expect immediate answers, quick results, and clear signs. And when those don't come, we start to question, God, are You really leading me? Did I hear You right? Is this even the right path? And that doubt, if left unchecked, can paralyze us. It can keep us stuck in a place of hesitation, afraid to move forward but unwilling to go back. But here's the thing, God doesn't need you to have it all figured out. He doesn't need you to see the entire path. He just needs you to trust Him enough to take the next step. Because every step of obedience, no matter how small, is part of His plan. And here's what's amazing about God's direction. He sees what we can't. He knows the obstacles ahead, but He also knows the breakthroughs. He knows the battles, but He also knows the victories. And He's not just guiding you, He's preparing the way for you. Think about Abraham, who was called to leave everything he knew, his home, his family, his comfort zone, and go to a land that God would show him. Not a land that was already mapped out, not a destination that was fully described, but a land that God would show him. Abraham had to leave without knowing where he was going. He had to trust that God's direction was enough, even when the details weren't clear. And because he trusted, he became the father of nations. His obedience unlocked a promise far greater than anything he could have imagined. That's what happens when we trust God's direction. It opens the door for His promises to unfold. But here's the key. Trusting God's direction isn't about passively waiting for Him to move. It's about actively walking in faith, even when the way feels uncertain. It's about saying, God, I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to follow You anyway. I don't see the full picture, but I trust that You do. And let's not ignore the reality that sometimes God's direction will lead us through difficult terrain. Sometimes the path He calls us to will feel harder than the one we left behind. But hard doesn't mean wrong. Just because the journey is challenging doesn't mean God isn't in it. In fact, it's often in the hardest moments that we experience His presence the most. It's in the wilderness where He provides. It's in the storms where He calms our fears. It's in the valleys where He restores our souls. The problem is, we often equate difficulty with being out of alignment with God's will. But if that were true, then Moses would have turned back when Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go. David would have given up when Saul was chasing him. Jesus would have walked away from the cross. The truth is, the difficulty is often the confirmation that we're on the right path, because the enemy doesn't fight what isn't a threat. So, if you're facing challenges as you follow God's direction, don't let that discourage you. Let it strengthen your resolve. Let it remind you that God's path is not just about getting you to the destination. It's about shaping you along the way. It's about growing your faith, building your character, and teaching you to depend on Him in every step. And don't forget this, God's direction isn't always about where He's taking you. Sometimes it's about who He's calling you to become. The process of following Him transforms you. It stretches you, refines you, and prepares you for what's ahead. Because the promise is not just about the destination, it's about the journey. So, wherever God is leading you, trust that His direction is perfect. Trust that He knows what He's doing even when you don't. And when you feel the urge to question, when you're tempted to doubt, remind yourself of this. God has never failed. His word has never returned void. His promises have never been broken. And He's not going to start with you. Keep walking. Keep trusting. Keep believing. Because the path He's calling you to, no matter how uncertain it feels, is the path that leads to His perfect plan for your life. Let me know if you need further adjustments.